Welcome. This is Fernanda Durand. I'm the Director of Media Relations for Communication Shop. Very nice to have you here today. We're thrilled to be bringing you this episode of the CS Breakdown, a monthly Facebook Live conversation about media coverage in the English language press. The goal of this is to elevate the issues affecting Latinos and the community and to foster a dialogue between journalists and the communities they cover. Today, we have the honor of having Dr. Richard Pineda. He is the chair of the Department of Communication at the University of Texas at El Paso. We are very glad to welcome you today. He will be moderating our conversation today. So thank you for joining us and take it away.
Fernanda, thank you very much. Muchas gracias and good afternoon. Welcome to today's conversation. As Fernanda indicated, I'm the chair of the Department of Communication at the University of Texas at El Paso, where I also serve as the director of the Sam Donaldson Center for Communication Studies. Our department is producing some of the highest quality bilingual, bicultural journalists in the country that are placing El Paso, I think, in a unique light. And I think that's a very important frame for today's conversation. We're joined by a number of panelists who bring to the forefront their experience as journalists, as well as activists in relationship to Latino voting in the United States. And today's conversation couldn't happen at a more opportune moment. This morning in federal courthouse in El Paso, there are arguments that are being made about the redistricting maps that the state of Texas is proposing. Those maps have come under fire for the way in which they attempted to gerrymander and change districts, and that is of immediate and substantial impact on Latino communities throughout the state of Texas. And so from virtually every corner of the state and a mix of perspectives, we're looking forward to a conversation today that allows us to be able to delve into some of those issues. As we talk to some of the different participants, I'll give a brief introduction so you'll know who is in the conversation. But I want to start with, I think, an important framing for the conversation. We're talking about the Latino vote and the Texas primaries, but the primary channel in which voters and potential voters and members of the Latino community get information is, in fact, through journalists. And so I want to start with a question to Rebecca Aguilar, who in 2021 became the first Latina and woman of color who serves as the president of the Society of Professional Journalists. And in our pre-conversation, Rebecca made a very interesting point. I want to start with you in that case, Rebecca. Why are these stories important? Why is the presence of Latino journalists important to conversations about the Latino vote? And how do you see that in this election, this primary in Texas?
I apologize for the mute there. First of all, we play a very important part as journalists. It doesn't matter if we're Latinos or not. We're the messenger. We're the one that the public counts on with the facts. And in this Texas primary, it is important because the public, whether Spanish language or not, they're waiting for us to get them the facts, but to really understand what's going on. There's so many moving parts right now, right? The redistricting, the rejection of people trying to vote a certain way. There are so many moving parts that journalists really have a challenge. And that means making sure they know what's going on, making sure who's making the decisions, making sure that every person who can vote gets the information. But more than anything, I think right now, people are trying to find the truth. Where do I get the truth? Because for a long time, at least for the past few years, people have been, in a sense, talked into not trusting the media, not trusting us reporters. I've been a reporter 40 years now. I've covered all elections, local, national, you name it. And every time I have to remember, I'm the messenger for the public. And also as a Latina, and also a Latina voter, you have to remember we are an important part of this state. People, politicians, they want our vote. But again, is the Latino community understanding? How will these politicians represent us? Are they telling us the truth? It is important for us to get it right from the beginning for them, whether it's radio, television, digital, or print. We have to get it right.
And that leads to a really significant question I want to pose to Franco Caliz-Aguilar, co-director of the Electoral Power Building of Community Change Action. Franco, this is not a new story, especially concerns when it comes to gerrymandering, when it comes to the exclusion of people of color, but in particular in Texas, of Latinos. But it seems like in every major election cycle, we're back to square one. Can you give us the inside from the activist perspective and maybe give us a sense of how this might change in a more permanent fashion and what's necessary, or is this something that we're just going to keep seeing every kind of major election?
Well, I think this is, first of all, thanks for having me and thanks for the question. Look, I think this is something that we see every 10 years when redistricting comes around. I think the current, if I'm not wrong, the current 23rd district in Texas, one of my favorite fun facts about Congress is that district is bigger than the country of France. And it has a lot of Latinos that were sort of included, but just enough to make sure that other districts were protected. I think the question that if I were a journalist, I'd be asking is, who is leading these redistricting efforts? Who are the ones drawing these maps in a way that lessens the voice of Latinos? And what can we as Latinos do? I got to tell you, when I talk to activists in Texas, when I talk to activists across the country, one of the first things that we see, that we hear a lot of is, how can I participate in a process that actually feels inclusive, where my voice is actually being heard? Texas is one of these key states where you are able to really make a huge difference as a Latino and the voting bloc of Latinos. But folks gotta be a little bit more aware of how to engage with their state level elected officials. That's a really big challenge. So it's this two-piece dance almost. The first one, I think, is how are we able to actually find out the information that we need in order to know who it is that we have to hold accountable when redistricting is happening? And I think the second part of it is, what are the very peaceful but still powerful ways that we can move forward to actually make our voices heard when the legislatures are doing open comment in some cases, when legislators' offices are open for public commenting, or even if it's, my local state representative, my state house person, going up to them and who those folks are. And that already puts you at like the top 5% of all Americans in knowing who your state official is, honestly.
Uriel, Posada, executive producer at ABC 13 in Houston, formerly with Univision here in El Paso, Texas. Uriel, I pose this question to you because you're seeing both sides of journalist outreach. So you're looking at the Spanish language approach to media and also English language. What can you give us in terms of insight in terms of how those stories are getting out? And are they, for lack of a better term, are they being translated well? I mean, did the community that you interacted with in El Paso take to news stories in the same way that the community in Houston does? Is there a different kind of explanation that's necessary when you're talking to Spanish-dominant Latinos in the political process?
They're very different. And first of all, thanks for the invitation to the communication shop. It's an honor to be here, and nice to see you. Nice to see you guys again. I was the regional news director for Univision in El Paso. I supervised Midland, Odessa, El Paso, and Albuquerque. And that's a very important question. It's very different when you are presenting the news for a Spanish language audience. If you compare that to what I'm doing here, trying to help out here in Houston, which is obviously a much larger city, much more diverse city, obviously. There are several challenges, I guess. Now that I am one of the executive producers here at KTRK ABC 13 in Houston. And this problem is not only affecting our market, but I think this problem is affecting a lot of the markets around the country. And I'm very lucky, though, that I'm working at a station which, a large percentage of the employees are people of color. However, we do need to improve, and we as not only as a station, but as a journalist of color and as a member of this community, I think that part of the problem lies in that we don't have representation, and I think that in order for for the Hispanic or Latino community to uh, be more informed, we do need to include Latinos or Hispanics in our decision making to begin with. I think that that's the first step. Um, we need to take our own decisions and make our voices heard and mold that coverage actually. And I'm lucky that I'm being able to do that as well.
I want to turn to Bob Moore now, the founder and editor of El Paso Matters. Bob and I do actually quite a few of these. My running joke is that we're available for nerdy quinceañeras everywhere across the state. So if you've got the need, we've got the bandwidth. Bob, in seriousness, we have the two of us, I think, because of proximity, have gotten to watch various iterations of Beto O'Rourke's campaigns, both for the U.S. Senate and then the run of the presidency, and now again at the governor's house in Austin. If we're talking about Latinos in these primaries and the significance that might play, how do Democrats swing the tide? Is that possible? Is O'Rourke the person that can do that, or is this likely to be a repeat? I mean, are Latino voters, especially those that might run left, are they going to be stuck in a position to not necessarily have the voice to change electoral politics in the state?
Yeah, that's a great question. First of all, I want to say hi to my friend Uriel. I haven't seen you in a while. We miss you here in El Paso, but you're doing great work in Houston. The challenges Beto faces, I think, also kind of speak more broadly to the challenges that the Democratic Party faces in Texas, and their whole strategy over the years has sort of been like this: demographic magic's going to happen, and boom, all of a sudden they're going to be the majority, which was very short-sighted. And obviously Latino voters play a huge role in any plan for the Democrats to turn the state. And obviously the Republicans, I think, see some opportunities now, which, to be frank, they a lot of what you're hearing, we've heard before, that Latinos are, because of their religious beliefs and their family nature, tend to be more conservative voters. And I've always thought that was a short-sighted viewpoint too. But the basic lesson for either party right now is you have to earn this vote, and it's not going to come simply by some demographic tipping point. You have to connect with people, and you have to ask them for their vote. And in 2020, in part because of the pandemic, I think Democrats just failed to really reach out to Latinos, particularly in Texas. And I think got a real wake-up call on election day. But there were also earlier wake-up calls too. I mean, when you go back to the Senate primary in 2018, when Beto was, I think, viewed by most of the media as unopposed, kind of forgetting that there were other people on the ballot, and Beto really underperformed in the Rio Grande Valley, and I think that was a wake-up call for them. The big challenge, so Beto at least is a product of the border. He understands Latinos because he grew up around them, but he's not Latino. And I think this speaks to part of the bigger challenges the Democrats face, is they've really not invested and grown that sort of next generation of Latino leadership. And so it's always like, oh, one of the Castro brothers is eventually going to run for something and we'll be fine. And now you've got, emerging leaders like Lina Hidalgo, I put right at the top of the list, but she's, certainly made it known that she's got more work to do in Harris County. So I think longer term, Democrats, if they want to really tap into the power of the Latino vote, have to produce leadership that is more like that demographic that they're going after. They have to show that they care about these issues and have to move off of just sort of simplified one-off explanations, which is not to say that immigration is not important. It is, but there are a lot of other issues there. And I think Beto at least is trying to speak to some of that, but whether he's going to be able to make inroads is another question. And the last thing I'll say about, because it's related, the Republican inroads in 2020, there's a line that kind of runs almost down the middle of the state. And you look at what happened on the border east of that line, and Trump made significant inroads. But west of that line, including in El Paso County, the Republicans kind of got back to where they were with Mitt Romney in 2012 in terms of share of the vote. So this idea that Republicans in Texas have found this magic sauce that's going to allow them to kind of become the majority party among Latinos, I think is short-sighted as well. It's a good reminder that there is no such thing as the Latino vote. Just like any other group, these are diverse people with diverse needs. And even on the border, El Paso is an incredibly different city than McAllen or Laredo, and they have different needs. And so any good candidate from either party is going to have to speak to those unique needs and recognize that this isn't just some monolithic block. These are human beings who have families and who have interests, and that's where you have to appeal to them.
Rebecca Aguilar, I have a question that is going to move a little bit away from this, because you have served as a mentor for countless journalists in the state of Texas, as well as across the Latino community of journalists. The demographic data of usage up through the late 80s indicated that Latinos drew a lot of their news from radio, and the explanation was simple, that would allow you could do something simultaneously and have radio on in the background. But now we're in a generation where the internet, the phone has almost jumped past television. From your perspective and from the reporters that you mentor, does the channel matter for political news? In other words, do you see Latino consumers drawing their information more from rapid hit internet news? Are they pulling it down from broadcast journalism? And the reason I ask this, and the reason I think this is significant is, you had referenced this idea of disinformation and whether or not information was accurate. And obviously one of the concerns I think every journalist, every journalism educator has is that the information that our consumers, that our students use and produce may be manipulated. So from your perspective, is there something unique about the channels that media needs to use to outreach to Latino voters?
Well, any smart media is using social media, first of all. And even though people, and a lot of Latinos, because you'll see that maybe Latinos may not have a car or even a TV or maybe a house, but they have their phones. They go to social media, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and guess what? But they're going to social media to find that story that's being, broadcast at KTRK, or maybe that's in the Texas Tribune. So what they're turning to is ultimately it's a domino effect, right? They go to social media, maybe Facebook, maybe Twitter, but they're really looking up the story from the New York Times, or maybe, from the Dallas Morning News or the Houston Chronicle or the local television. That's where they're turning. And that's important. So if we are smart journalists, we use it there to promote our stories, but also to ask the questions of, and I'm going off something that Franco had said earlier, where do we get our information? Find those journalists, and I say this to the public, that you trust, but at the same time as the media, because again, I'm thinking what Franco just said, we have to do a deep dive into every person running for office, every party. And of course, you're right, the Latino community, while it was thought that they're all Democrats, they all are making up their own minds. So back to your question, they're going to social media, mostly on their phones, because this goes with us everywhere, right? But it is a domino effect. They are finding their favorite TV station, maybe their favorite radio station, both in English and Spanish. Again, social media is great in both languages, in any language. So I hope that answers that question, but I hope that the journalists who are listening to this realize it is important to make sure that you're listening to the public on the phone too. Ask them, what do you want to know? Because like Franco said, people are trying to go, where do I get my information? You could be that link.
Can I just add one really quick thing here? One of the things I was looking at Eki's research, I believe. One of the things that they were saying is that Latinos, their new nightly news is now YouTube. That means that there's a real gap between how the press is being viewed and their interaction and understanding of where that some of this information is coming in, and where the actual consumers, in this case us as Latinos, are actually getting a lot of this information from. And that to me is a really alarming thing, because then you don't have the standards that you normally have. And this is also a problem long term for news organizations, when not only are y'all not being trusted as much, but then on the other side of it, you're then losing viewership, you're losing readership, right, to these unvetted sources, which is harmful to our democracy, frankly. So part of what I wonder is, like, what kind of representation are we really getting in the traditional news sources? We talked a lot about Beto, but we didn't talk a whole lot about Michelle Tremillo, who's been the head of TOP, Texas Organizing Project in Texas, and has made a huge difference in what the core urban areas of the state look like politically, right? So how are we engaging with those community leaders? How are we building that trust with and having that two-way communication with our readers, with our viewers as well? I think is a really key question.
And I can attest to that, if I can add something in, without giving away too much information. But we just finalized a focus group in which we obviously asked Latinos, Hispanics around the area what we were looking for in terms of getting their information. And what we found out, and Rebecca is right, Latinos are very connected. And I think that at least here in this county, in Harris County, the audience, as far as the social media and web clicks, are up for grabs, actually. None of the media here has the advantage. And that's where the media has an opportunity, actually, to get those that audience, actually. So yeah, it's very important to realize that social media and everything that has to do with technology is really important, and we are connected. We're very connected, and the challenge for media, it's now to see what's going to be the way we are going to distribute that information, either traditional television, social, website, or any other streaming services.
I just want to
Uriel, let me follow up. Give me just a second, Rebecca. Let me follow up with Uriel. So, one of the breaking stories this week is the FBI raid of Henry Cuellar's house. That by itself has radically changed that primary, which many people had assumed Cuellar had locked up. Now, all of a sudden, the primary is potentially back in play. From your perspective as executive producer, it's impossible not to cover the story, number one. So it's going to get attention. But you now have a Latino figure, one who is well recognized, not necessarily in Houston, but in the Valley, and certainly in Texas politics. And you've got a salacious part of the story, because the FBI hasn't released very many of the details associated with what has happened. As executive producer, covering that story is going to have an impact on the primary regardless. And your role obviously is to be the person to use Rebecca's expression, that is bringing truth, right? Is bringing fact and not interpretive. But at certain points, very clearly, this is going to have a rollover effect on a particular audience, right? I mean, we've seen this when figures that are out of the Latino community are under scrutiny, and the effect that it has in terms of confidence and in terms of relatability. What do you see in those Latino audiences potentially, and is that something that doesn't play into an editorial decision about the story the way that it gets covered? And is it something that as you see, will have an effect potentially on that race for Cuellar's seat?
I really don't know. I'm not a commentator, but obviously it will have an effect, obviously, and our responsibility is to just stick to the facts in this case. No, I haven't read lately what happened, only the fact that he was being searched for something that happened in Azerbaijan, something like that. But we do have to report it, and we do have to just stick to the facts and not speculate or say something that is not factual.
And
But
Rebecca,
I
sorry,
do think I do think there's gonna be an effect, obviously.
right. Rebecca, sorry, back to you.
Yeah, well, and following up on that, it doesn't matter, whether he's Latino or not. If you're a politician and you're being, the feds or local law enforcement is coming in, it's a story. We're not going to cover it as like, in hopes that the Latino community doesn't get angry with us because he's Mr. Popular on the board or wherever, right? Our job is just to tell the truth. In fact, SPJ has a code of ethics, if people don't know out there. And the code of ethics basically says this: seek the truth and report it. That's what we do. Minimize harm. Act independently. Just because one reporter is doing it one way doesn't mean you have to do it that way. And lastly, be accountable and transparent. That's our job as reporters, as journalists, the code of ethics. And if you don't follow these, then you're not a very good journalist. And that's important because what does this do? It builds trust. The public needs to trust us. As ABC 13 has its viewers. Why? Because they trust that these people are going to bring the truth, not like, okay, he's Latino, the Latino reporter does it, it's going to be all favorable. No, our job is not to be your brand builder or to, make you Mr. Popular. Our job is to seek the truth, put it out there. Now, again, if you're a commentator, you're going to be able to say what you want. If you're an opinion writer, you can do that too. But we constantly have to remind people that as journalists, our job is to tell both sides and let the public make up its mind.
Franco, let me tag back into something that you had mentioned, something that I think is significant when we talk about this particular primary in Texas, but I think is a bigger issue. Voters, regardless of background, are much more excited about presidential election years. And you can draw people to the ballots just on that sort of excitement level. But from your perspective as an activist, when we talk about things like the census, which then has a rollover effect on what the redistricting looks like, which then has an effect on how communities are engaged. What part of those stories, because when the census stories happen, or when people are talking about the shape of what a district looks like, those are not interesting stories, right? That's minutia. It gets very complicated. It doesn't have the kind of appeal, whereas a presidential story, right, that draws a lot of folks. From an activist perspective, what's missing in the way those stories are told? Or is it a function of maybe making more information available? Is it that there's too much information? Kind of hitting on some of the points you've talked about already.
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One, I think it's something like 15% of all registered voters, regardless of background, are what makes up the Texas primaries. And so with the Latino portion of that is in the single digits. So again, this is a place where Latinos really, if they turn out to vote, can have a significant impact on it and make sure that they are heard in the next couple of elections. I think, as it pertains to sort of the census story and then the sort of secondary effects of that, it's one thing to be able to say, look at these districts are not being, like, it's a process story, and people don't understand what that means when they're putting food on the table, when they're sending their kids to school. So I think it's about humanizing it, right? What does this actually mean for funding in Houston? Does this mean that one of the largest school districts in the country is going to be underfunded because of an undercount? How are we actually processing the level of social services that are going to be affected by this? When we really humanize that story, and when we tell the story of those who are currently going through those services, that's when we're actually able to process what that means. But that's like, it's a little like the number 1 trillion. It's a huge number. No one really knows what it means because it's almost hard to visualize what that is. When you're just hearing about, District 8 or District 7, and these two are being drawn together, it doesn't mean a whole lot to people. When you're hearing, the census is undercounting. Okay, but what does that mean for my life? How am I going to process that day in and day out? And so I think one of the things we have to do is we have to try to meld a little bit of more the human element and the actual stories of what people on the ground are going to feel and how their services and how their lives are going to be impacted on. And I think that's to me, that's a nonpartisan, straight down the middle kind of story. Is like, if you're aiming for special needs, if your child has special needs and you need more services, is your school going to be able to provide those services? Are the roads going to be able to be maintained in a way that's going to be equitable to make it so that things can flow a little bit better on the commerce side? I'm interested though in something Rebecca said, which was it's our job to present both sides and to seek truth. I think the one question that I sort of always harbor is how do we deal when we're talking about seeking truth when you have, and I'll just use the example of one of your neighboring former senators of Inhofe, right? When he walked into the Senate floor and he had a snowball. And he said, well, global warming isn't real. It's snowing outside, right? Well, a lot of data shows, overwhelming amounts of data, that climate change is real. So how do we make it so that in a situation where there's overwhelming data on one side, that we're honest about what it is that the truth actually means, right? We can't just say, oh, I don't believe in gravity. I held a balloon up. I had it filled with helium. I saw it go out into the wind. It didn't come back down. Gravity is not real. That's not two sides to that story. There's just one fool with a balloon, right? So like, how do we actually cover that in a way that is equitable, and where our readers, our viewers, and community members both can build up the trust in journalism, and also understand that it's not a partisan attack to say that something is being misrepresented or misframed? Because to give an example, it took a really long time for a lot of major news networks to start calling it the big lie, right? When we're looking at what Trump has done. So how do we balance that need to be fair with the need to be just in what we're covering? I think is one of the questions that I'm grappling with.
Well, I'm going to jump in real quick on that one. How do we do it? You just continue looking for those experts. For example, when one person says, well, climate change doesn't exist, and look at this snowball or whatever, you do find the scientists. You constantly do the deep dive. You don't just go for the easy, oh, look on TV, look what they did, that kind of thing. That is our job. We are trained journalists. If you're a good storyteller, you're going to go out there and find it. Now, are there lazy journalists out there? Heck yes. Like there are in any profession. But that is our job. If we are committed to tell the truth, then we do what I call deep dives. And going at what you said, Franco, humanize the story. There's something that we talk about in journalism. It's always put a face to the story. It is important to break it down. And, it is important as journalists to constantly be educating and engaging. I want to hear from the reader, from the TV viewer. What do you want? What am I missing? That's important that people are doing today. Thank God for social media, because you can tell me on Twitter. But, again, Franco, going to that is constantly being the journalist that's committed to this. It's not brain surgery. All you do is, if someone says this, you find the other side, because the truth is out there. And you're right. It took a while for especially the media to say, yes, Donald Trump is lying. They went to what were the terms they were using that were kind of sanitized? Misinformation, falsehood. Come on, people. I don't know how many times on Twitter just say he's lying. It's okay. Have what we say, the calzones to say it, And that's where I think reporters, not all of them, because there's thousands out there, they didn't have the courage to say it. Because why? They were afraid the Republicans would be upset. But a lie is a lie. That's all there is to it. So I hope, I addressed what you
But I do think, and just to add to what you're saying, Rebecca, we do have to advance that conversation. And this not only falls into each reporter's responsibility, because they can do so much. It falls on us, on managers, to advance that conversation. And I can give you an example. Here in ABC 13 Houston, we hired our first race and culture reporter. This person is going to be reported, obviously, on all those stories that have to do with race, culture, minorities, Black Americans, Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, Asian Americans, LGBTQ issues, for example. That falls on the management responsibility to go a little bit further and realize that communities like the one in Houston, for example, or like the one in El Paso, for example, or Albuquerque, where I used to work, it is really important for us to tell our own stories, actually.
And I say this too, Franco, real quick, Franco. We need people like you to hold us accountable. We need you guys to call up and say, look, you guys aren't answering. You're not giving us the information we need. So I strongly say to activists, advocates out there, pick up the phone, news director, editor. Why aren't you covering this? Because when you say it, then they'll say, Rebecca, we need you on it. And that helps us. Because Uriel is right.
Really helpful.
I say to anybody in the public out there, call up, because the bottom line is the media is a business. We need you to buy the ads. We need you to buy into the commercials. So we're a business, a reality check. So when I hear from someone like you and say, hey, you guys went and covered this, but not this Latino thing. Okay, you're holding us accountable. And we must. This is how we build trust. So everybody's got a voice, use it, and hold us accountable.
So one of the things we talked about in the conversation was we will entertain questions as they come in. Fernanda, you have one for us.
Yes, we do. So Javier Aguilar says, unfortunately, the Latino community doesn't have the initiative to go out and vote. I hear it firsthand from my own family. How do you change their mind and prove to them that their vote can count, and not only for the presidential elections, for statewide elections? So I think there's a real feeling that we can't change that old narrative, and sometimes in the Latino community that says, well, it's not going to matter. I'm not even going to bother. Why? And that comes from, obviously, from a history of being marginalized as voters. But how do we change that?
So let me start on that, and then I actually want to tag Bob into this conversation. I mean, one thing that I think, to get to Javier's question, I think one thing that's a challenge that's been missed is the more complicated that voter schemes get, especially micro-targeting, what ends up happening is it becomes a snowball. So as a campaign can very narrowly target a message to active voters in a certain area. I mean, if you took like a city residential block, you can very well figure out that there's only 4 people you need to talk to out of 10 houses, and that's because those 4 people have voted before. They show up on the voter records, and so this begets then more micro-targeting, and that micro-targeting means that if you're a neighbor that doesn't vote, and if you're Latino or really of any background, then you're not going to be included in the conversation. And so there's a structural issue which is tied to how campaigns develop their database and how those databases are used to pull candidates in. But then you do have some practical issues where there is an active system that is moving to disenfranchise voters. And that's where I wanted to bring Bob into the conversation. This more, as I started right before you came on, Bob, I made reference to the fact that downtown El Paso today, there's a panel of 3 federal judges who are hearing a redistricting case, a redistricting map in Tarrant County. This action was brought by, among other groups, MALDEF, as well as the Department of Justice. Can you give us a little bit of insight into that case and where you think the biggest dangers are of redistricting when it comes to the Latino vote in Texas?
So a lot of questions in there, and I think Franco is better situated to answer some of them than I am. But the one thing, to go back to the question that Fernanda posed, I think we have to first start by acknowledging that that sentiment that my vote doesn't matter comes from a very real place, and it's not just something that you tell somebody, oh no, abuelo, no, you're wrong, that your vote does count. I mean, there's historic foundation to all of that. And I still think the main reason that people don't vote is because they're not asked. And structurally, and I'll use El Paso as an example because it's the community I know best. We have this traditionally low turnout that, in a presidential year, we're lucky to crack 50%. And then in midterms like this year, and especially in primaries, what are candidates going to do? They're going to go after the voters that they know are most likely to vote. So they go and they look at who are the ones that voted in the last 3 Democratic primaries, and that's what I'm going to target. And then the whole rest of the universe gets excluded. That is not an irrational decision by a candidate. So I think we have to start with the understanding that candidates aren't going to be the solution to convincing people to vote, that it's going to be NGOs, media, and others. So I think that's kind of where I would start with. I'm very interested in Franco's perspective there too. On the redistricting case, very interesting. Obviously, that case was filed in El Paso in the Western District. This is an art that Republican groups have kind of mastered over the years. When you look at the lawsuits they filed challenging some of the Biden administration's policies, they go right into those districts that are kind of packed with Trump judges. So El Paso doesn't have any Trump-appointed judges. So I think it's interesting that that's why the venue is there. Any redistricting case, and again, Franco is going to know more about this than me, but any redistricting case in the current environment with recent Supreme Court rulings that have sort of all but cleared the way for even political gerrymandering going to be very, very difficult to sustain. And Texas is going to be a good test case because there are clearly some very indefensible lines that were drawn. I mean, indefensible other than, yeah, we want Republicans to win. But it's going to be an interesting case. And, even if there's a favorable decision out of El Paso, then all of a sudden you're in front of the Fifth Circuit, which is not going to be a friendly venue. So it's going to be interesting to watch. But I don't hold out much belief that the courts are going to aggressively go after these redistricting cases, even as aggressively as they did back 10 years ago. And that wasn't very aggressive either. So anyhow, that's again, I defer to Franco on all this, but I just want to kind of share those thoughts.
And Franco, actually, I do want to turn to you with the sort of segue from Bob's point. In your experience and what you're seeing now, are activists, or at least some of the folks you've worked with, are they leery of taking these challenges to the courts, or is that where you think the most kind of action is going to be? Or do you see this being, we've got to register voters, the voters have to show up to start making inways? I mean, what from your strategic sense do you think might happen in Texas? You don't need to necessarily talk about like this specific case, the Tarrant County case, but I mean, just from your perspective.
Yeah, I think it's a both and approach. Maybe it's not the most satisfying answer, but I think there's legal avenues that are obviously being taken already, and that's, to me, is sort of the structural piece to it. At the same time, living within the world that we're in, right? It's how much voter registration can a group like Move Texas do? How much voter registration can we really do in high schools to make sure that we're still talking to folks who are going to be motivated to vote and who are pretty, who have a different vision for what they want their lives and a long period of their adulthood to look like. So I think it's a both and approach, and frankly, redistricting unfortunately has made it so that the concentration of resources that probably would have been dedicated to Texas and to getting out the vote from both parties is now much more light because of the fact that so many districts are not competitive at the federal level, and that's a little bit of the political reality. So I think a lot of the organizations are now looking at what are the in-state things that we can do to change the dynamics. I really, it's hard for me to sort of give a narrow answer to what is really my life's work. I'm sure it's like what you guys feel when I want to talk about journalism. So we were talking about Latinos and how they don't feel like their vote is being heard. Well, one, I would say what I'm hearing is a lot of disaffection over the fact that a lot of the policies that are popular with Latinos aren't being passed, and whether that's Republican or Democratic, it holds true, and that helps create some disaffection. What we do at my job, and what my job is every single day, is to try to figure out how is it that we target a little bit differently than what Bob said. I think the traditional way that candidate campaigns do is, yes, they go into these areas and they say, all right, these are the 5 voters who vote every single election, and if we target them and we convince them, then we have a chance of winning. I think that's sort of outdated thinking that's not going to change the current dynamics. To me, the treasure chest for voters is, who are the new voters that we can register to vote? Who are the people who maybe voted in one of the last 3 or 4 elections? So we know that they have some level of interest in elections, but maybe they don't feel or they don't know how that's going to impact their day in and day out. To me, that's, and Texas, we talked about how too often Democrats in Texas thought that demographics is destiny. God, if I hear that one more time, my head's going to explode, right? But to me, it's what our polling and our focus groups have shown is that Democrats and Republicans both think that Hispanic voters are lazy. We're not lazy. We work our butts off every single day. Instead, the reality is many Latinos feel like they are afraid to make the wrong choice, so that they don't have the level of information required to actually make a choice as important as president or Senate or House or whatever, right? Down to dog catchers, I always say. The other piece here is, I think, in 2020, you saw a real disservice to the Latino community. I'll say largely, I think on the side of the Democratic Party, but I think in general, when folks sort of said, we're not going to go out and canvass, obviously there were health reasons there, but that decreased the amount of attention that community got. That made it a lot harder to be able to communicate with so many of these folks as well. And that's something that I think is going to change in 2022 because people have sort of learned how to do this a little bit differently. I know that states that took the lead, like Georgia, Arizona, were able to have different results in some of those places. And the other thing here that I'll say is we do a lot of what we call relational organizing. Look, at the end of the day, the folks watching this stream have their opinions, and me blabbing on here probably isn't going to change their minds on something, right? But the difference is if I'm able to talk to your aunt or your neighbor who who you have a personal relationship with and who you can sort of leverage that relationship. Now my dog's going off. But if you can leverage that relationship with someone who you already trust and know, then you're actually able to have real conversations that go deeper and that matter a lot more to the voter. And that's where you're able to get a lot of these voters who maybe don't trust the system, right? Who don't see the impact happening in their lives. But there are tangible things that are impacting our community. The child tax credit is a great example of this. How many of us know folks who are getting $300 a month for every single kid, right? That they have, who that's no longer in their lives. So that's money going out of their pockets because of policy decisions that are happening right now. Those are tangible things that make a difference in people's lives. And when it's someone who's trusted, who is talking to you about something like that, it makes a pretty big difference, both to your wallet and to the way that you're thinking about engaging in politics too.
Uriel, I've got a question, and then I'm hoping Rebecca might have some insight into this as well. In places like El Paso, some of the other markets that you've worked, Uriel, first-generation immigrants, whether they're from Mexico or other parts of Latin America, but especially Central Americans, come to the United States disaffected about the political process, and their relationship to that political process may in fact be the reason that they came to the United States in the first place. As you told stories, first as a reporter in front of the camera, and then as you moved to news director, is there something? I mean, Rebecca talked about the idea of making sure that there's faces to these stories, but is there something else in terms of how you crafted your stories or how you trained your reporters to craft those stories? Because there is a unique challenge with that audience, right? I mean, you were in Spanish language media, so the language wasn't a barrier in that case, but the fact that their interest level, because of trauma or because of the experience they had coming into the United States, may create that disjuncture. Did you do something that was different in the way that you wanted those stories told?
Yeah, we have to realize that those people who newly immigrated to the United States are coming from countries with high levels of corruption. And as you said, they're disaffected and they're disillusioned, and they don't want anything to do with any political system. And they bring the baggage to the United States. And our responsibility, especially in the Spanish media side, is that we do have a responsibility to kind of educate them and tell them how the system works, so they can, be working with it a little bit better, actually. So I think that's one of the difference between Spanish language and English language. For example, we cater to English language caters to a different part of the population, but as a news director in the Spanish side, yeah, you have to, educate them and tell them how, with peritas and manzanas, como se dice en español, how the system works. I mean, that's what they're waiting for, and that's why they immigrated to the United States in the first place. Actually, just to get rid of what they were living and experience a different way of life, and that comes from educating them about the immigration process, about the voter registration process. There's a challenge not only to register them to vote, but to get them out to the polls. I mean, that doesn't work if you just register them and they don't vote. You know what I mean? And a challenge in getting people to run for something. I mean, if we want to affect change, I mean, people have to run. And I'll give you an example. Houston City Council, for example, has 11 districts position and 5 at-large positions. It's the only major city in the state that has at-large positions. and some activists say that that's keeping people, Hispanic Latinos, from getting elected. There's only one Latino in city council. Only one Latino, where 46% of our population in Harris County is Hispanic. So you do the math. That's where our responsibility comes, actually, as Latino Hispanic journalists. As I said before, we need to be able to tell a story. Now I'm realizing it even more that I'm working in a bigger city like Houston. It's a big difference when I was working with Bob Moore in El Paso, for example, which sometimes we kind of take it for granted that the majority of the population there. So we just have to be very aware of that.
Rebecca, your follow up to that.
Yeah, let me follow up to what Uriel said. What's important, especially in these big media companies, is to have people like Uriel especially in management positions in English language, because he can't say, wait a minute, what are we doing covering here the Latino community, the Latino vote? He can help educate the non-Latino reporter on, direct him in the right way, in the right area to get the facts. That's important. But one of the things that I want to address, because, I see Javier that asked the question that Latino voters aren't getting out there to vote. I think the media can help in this area. If we have town halls, whether in English and Spanish, in Inglés o en Español, town halls are important. And the beauty about any kind of, virtual platform, whether it's this one or Zoom or whatever, that the public can come and ask questions from the media, because they seek information from us, not only from activists and advocates, but from us too. A town hall is good. A social media campaign, break it down, keep it simple. Sometimes what I tell political reporters is, you're over here, man, you forgot, give me the basics here. And I tell people, again, your viewers here, is no question is a dumb question. No question is a dumb question. I remember recently I asked a white guy, do you even know what microaggressions mean? And he's a good friend. He's like, not really. And I go, so why don't you ask me? And he's like, I don't want to look stupid. That's the same thing with voting and elections. People don't want to look dumb, so they don't ask. And so if they don't ask and they don't know the information, they don't vote. So there's a big responsibility for the media to do better. But again, we also have to be in those decision-making positions like Uriel to say, hey, we're not doing a good job covering this area.
And once you're up there, or once you're in a management position in a journalistic institution, you have to keep raising your voice and raise your hand. Because there is a lot of media outlets out there who are going to minimize the importance of the Latino community. Let's face it, that's happening. That has always happened. And we just have to say, hey, aquí estoy, I'm here, I'm Uriel with the accent, but hey, this matters because of this.
And yeah, you're right. You're right on that, because there are some people of color put in positions of decision making, and they're just there. They're the people of color of convenience. There he is, my Black person, my Latino, my Asian. No, if you are given this responsibility, not only in the media, but in any industry, don't be the token. Be the person that's committed and courageous to say, hey, I'm here, I have a voice, it's time to make a difference.
Uriel, one correction. You don't have an accent, I have an accent, at least here in El Paso.
Bob, let me go to you with the last question. So, we're looking at the Texas primaries. We're trying to evaluate or report or give some insight to how the Latino vote's going to affect that. What does the Texas primary portend for the national picture? Because in some ways, one thing that I think is interesting about being in Texas is that we are in a bubble in lots of ways. We're a state where a former president still trends relatively high, will likely show up in some races in the primary and potentially even in the general. Are there any sort of takeaways that you see out of this primary that reflect on the potential impact of the Latino vote, or are there things that so goes Texas, so goes the nation?
I guess I go back to the point Franco made about how small the turnout is in Texas primaries and how even in the best of times, Latinos make up a small part of that. So unless something in there changes in the next 6 weeks, I don't know that there's much that we can read out of the primary. I agree with Franco that that Latinos have an opportunity in this race to have a very important say in what comes out of these primaries. I think there's going to be a lot of attention paid in November to see, around this narrative that's emerging. And I hate emerging narratives, by the way. This narrative that's emerging that Republicans have sort of found the magic way to reach Latino voters. And I think and if they always, of course, look at the Valley. The one thing I just have to remind my media colleagues across the country, the vast majority of Latinos in Texas don't live in the Valley, don't live in El Paso. They live in the big urban areas in Texas. And that's where, if I was a political scientist or an organizer, that's where I would be focusing my attention now to see what's happening on the ground in Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and the suburban structure around there. That's the real story of what's going on in Texas.
Bob Moore, Franco Caliz-Aguilar, Rebecca Aguilar, and Uriel Posada, thank you so much. Fernanda, I think you will take us out.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Pineda, and thank all of our guests. This has been a fascinating conversation. I think it's brought a lot into this discussion, and I'm really glad that you guys all were here and our audience as well. We will have this on podcast, and you can also watch it again and share it with your friends on Facebook on this page. So we will see you next time, a month from now, for our the CS Breakdown. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.